Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations, one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we're going to speak about research methods in international relations and politics. Research methods are at the core of understanding and analyzing international relations, providing scholars with the tools to explore complex global issues. In this interview, we will explore the evolving landscape of research methodologies in international relations and politics with Professor Christopher Lamont. Hello.
Thank you, Martin, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here to discuss methods with you.
Christopher Lamont is the Dean of ETREC's International Relations Program and Vice Dean of the Graduate School of International Relations at the Tokyo International University in Japan. Besides his long list of publications, there is a new one. And it's written together with Mieczysław Boduszynski, and the book is well known for those who deal with research in international relations. It's called Research Methods in Politics and International Relations, second edition. And it's a great coincidence because I always wanted to speak with Chris as I use his book in my teaching, so I know this book very well. But I haven't had a look at the second edition yet. So I think what we can do, we can go through some basic questions, some more advanced questions. But firstly, Chris, let's introduce this book by few sentences. And what do you think is the main difference between the first and the second edition?
Well, there's a lot of updating that has happened since the first edition, and it's not just in terms of like empirical examples, but it relates more broadly to kind of a broader content scope. So the first edition of politics, research methods in politics and international relations, looked at kind of this kind of dichotomy between like quantitative and qualitative methods, and instead of framing methods that way, my co-author and I, Mieczysław Boduszynski, sought to introduce additional chapters that would look at particular methods, tools, and go deeper into these, providing kind of students with more concrete examples, and also looking at going through kind of a research project from start to finish as well in parallel. So there's more learning features, more examples, and more chapters. So you'll notice that the second edition is a much kind of bigger book than the first.
Almost all projects, and when you write a research grant, they ask for interdisciplinary. So right. How does the epistemological shift towards interdisciplinarity reshape the boundaries of social science research and its methodological coherence? And why we want interdisciplinary, like why we want interdisciplinary research? What's the cause of that?
Okay, there are a couple elements to this question, and it's a very good one. And the kind of the last element is like why kind of what is the value of interdisciplinary research versus kind of disciplinary research that kind of exists within a particular field and draws from a particular canon and literature and kind of way of knowing and doing things. And you mentioned that there are a lot of incentives and pressures, right? It's not just kind of in terms of research grants, but if you think about how universities even organize themselves in terms of departments, kind of blurring of the boundaries and kind of a incentivization of this that is new. But we can take a step back also and think about kind of how modern a lot of our disciplines are, right? So that's looking at the other side of this. And you think about early literature scholarship in international relations and some of the kind of the methodological debates that are taking place today. And you see kind of look at, so where does like Hans Morgenthau fit into that, for example, right? So looking at kind of both sides here, one, there is value, right? There is value in looking at different ways of answering particular questions that can be approached from different perspectives. But if we're looking at interdisciplinarity for the sake of interdisciplinarity, and you don't understand kind of what the purpose is, then this is where I think you get into problems of kind of coherence that you kind of allude to in relation to the social sciences. And so if we kind of stake out and we kind of think about, okay, so what is the purpose of this engagement? What are we drawing from? And we maintain consistency in terms of our own methodological approach in our research. This isn't necessarily something that should lead to kind of greater incoherence, but also kind of would allow for a broader and more relevant conversation relating to kind of our research findings.
And do you feel any incentives slash pressure to pursue the interdisciplinary research when you compare, for instance, Japan, where you are based, and other parts of the world, like maybe your colleagues from Western Europe, maybe you have colleagues in Australia, Africa, or other Asian countries? Is it like sort of Western European or North American trend, or is it everywhere?
This is a really good question, right? Because I before I came to Japan, I was based in the Netherlands, right? And they kind of in a international relations department that had emerged from a history department, right? So which had its own particular genealogy. And before that, as you know, I'd done my kind of PhD kind of work in the United Kingdom, and now I'm here in Japan. And kind of the common thread is I've been in international relations or politics departments kind of across the board. And the pressures are very different, I would say, particularly when it comes to the understanding of international relations and where it is. I'd say that kind of in my own particular kind of narrow context here, there isn't pressure as such, right, to kind of do interdisciplinary work. Um, but at the same time, if you look at kind of the structure of kind of how one applies for funding and for grants, and you look at kind of the tables, depending on the type of research you're doing in international relations, you could actually be speaking to very different people who are reviewing your grant, right? They could be historians, it could be lawyers, right? Or it could be or it could be political scientists, and you would have to be aware of that. So in relation to pressures, right? It's not necessarily kind of one here within this particular context that I find myself in, where you would see particular pressure to engage interdisciplinarily, but at the same time, given how international relations exists and is embedded here within this institution, which is different than other institutions, even within Japan, right? There isn't a lot of pressure.
To what extent is mixed methods in research popular at the moment? And do you think it creates sort of synthesis, or it is a compromise? Sometimes maybe I'm conducting research and I have like strong part that I am very confident, so I use sort of discourse. And then the second part, maybe it's supported by some data based on statistics. So I have like two methods blended in one. And then I'm thinking, is it a strong research, or is it my sort of speculative approach that I use mixed research methods because I wanted to write that particular article and research particular topic? So what is the contemporary overview of mixed methods?
Well, first, I mean, it gets back a little bit to the first question about interdisciplinarity. It kind of really gets back to the question that you are asking, and whether or not the particular tools that you are applying kind of help advance you along that pathway in answering the question. Now, of course, when we think about mixed methods research, often the kind of the most common way of understanding this would be some sort of, as you alluded to, kind of bringing together of quantitative and qualitative tools. And sometimes this can be done just as a way to justify your kind of qualitative case study, right? So for example, you might look at data and be like, oh, this is an outlier here. So why why is it an outlier, right? Or you might look at, so why does this conform, right, in relation to data? And depending on kind of the logic that you are using, either as a case selection strategy, or as you mentioned here, is kind of like you're supplementing kind of discursive data with statistical data, that data is data, right? And because of that, right, there are many different ways we can integrate this. And there's also kind of a shifting of boundaries. And I think that's one of the reasons why when my co-author Mieczysław Borodzinski and I were asked to kind of come up with a second edition of the Politics and International Relations textbook, there was a sense of like, rather than kind of the kind of typical or traditional quantitative, qualitative, and mixed baskets to go more into particular kind of tools, kind of research methods themselves, without necessarily kind of putting them within these broad kind of containers, meaning that, okay, you might use descriptive statistics to supplement some other qualitative study, and that makes perfect sense, right? Rather than conceiving this as kind of quantitative versus qualitative, you'd be looking at how that data helps inform a particular answer to a question. And also keeping in mind that inferential statistics are kind of very different as well as the types of purposes they serve. So kind of separate chapters on that, in addition to a number of different strategies. We might think about like discourse analysis, we might think of narrative analysis or thematic analysis, right? Or context analysis, like content. These all provide answers to particular questions. And often, right, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive from one another. Now, we can talk about that a little bit more in greater detail, but the idea that bringing things together in conversation is somehow diluting is only diluting if the overall logic or the overall research purpose does not align, right? That if you're just kind of choosing or taking different methods and kind of gathering and analyzing data without a coherent structure in which to do that, or worldview within the data.
Do you have any favorite mixed research method combination that you use?
For me, and so this is an interesting kind of question that you have posed, is I often kind of grapple with many of these challenges that we describe in the textbook in the course of my own research. One, because often I have been interested in phenomena or things, objects of study, right, where there are not a whole lot of cases, right? And that was kind of going back to my kind of PhD years of doing research on explaining state compliance with kind of International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia orders, right? You have an N of hundreds, right? But then you break it down countries, right? You're looking kind of a little bit smaller. And so for me, I find in terms of kind of that work, kind of the use of process tracing tools can be very helpful, right? In understanding complex causal questions where you are seeking to evaluate a number of different potential causes that fit within that. I'd say that's one element, but also another interest is because kind of going through, right, kind of interest in transitional justice more broadly, inevitably or kind of inherently draws draws attention to kind of the question of meaning, right? So I found this is really interesting back in kind of some of the early researches is that just because a state complies with something, kind of does something, does not necessarily mean much beyond that Compliance Act, and that Compliance Act can be understood in a number of different ways. So how are these acts framed, right? And so I think here you're bringing together kind of like you're looking at various data points, and one can be collecting kind of the total number, and then you're saying, okay, so what does that mean, right? Because that's really what we are often interested in.
I'm glad you mentioned causality and also sort of complexity. How do you think that this debate is influencing the positivist research tradition?
This gets into this question of not interdisciplinarity that we started with, but this question of methodology versus methodologies in international relations more broadly. And there are some, right, who would kind of argue that there is kind of a single coherent logic, right, methodology that all disciplinary knowledge must conform to, right? And this is not just something that happens within international relations, but within other fields as well. And if you take that, right, to kind of its kind of conclusion, you get to a very narrow, right? And so one of the interesting things here is when you think about kind of classical kind of positivist texts in relation to kind of international relations, but politics more broadly, the emphasis is on kind of theory testing, theory generation, but in relation to what you had mentioned, right? This kind of testing causal assumptions. And as we know, causality is much more, and it has been, right? This is not new, right? Um, um, is a phenomena that some would argue is not easily captured, right, by kind of these kind of unit causal models of any social process. And here, getting into this kind of richer, more kind of contextual view of causality is not necessarily, right, a kind of, and this is where kind of sometimes terminology, if we think about kind of positivism versus kind of also like empiricism and empirical research, where there's a tendency to take kind of one approach, one kind of positivist tradition, and apply it to all empirical research, which is not the case, right? Is something that there are kind of a number of different approaches through which we can evaluate empirical material and also understand causality, right? So if you think about kind of literature and international relations that talks about kind of different understandings of the concept of causality itself. Like, so kind of we can think about causality very broadly as a set of processes that make certain actions, right, kind of on the menu of policymakers, right, or things that we think about, or we can think about causality, as you said, like kind of going backwards, like, so why did this happen, right, or why was this decision made? They both are approaching questions relating to international affairs from different approaches and using different evaluative standards. So rather than like saying that necessarily one challenges, right, kind of input in this kind of adversarial kind of language, the other, they both provide different ways of answering specific questions that are different, right? And this is where we get back to this question of purpose, but also the question, the research question itself, that a lot of times students will come and they won't think a lot about the right? Or even like sometimes we come up with a question and we're not too kind of focused on kind of the way that the question is phrased or kind of the vocabulary that we use to constitute the question, but that implies a lot, right? Meaning that if we're looking at kind of simply why did something happen versus how did something happen or how is something possible, right? These all imply different ways of looking at a question. So if we see kind of the kind of define kind of the positivist tradition as one that's kind of occupying or kind of seeks to be kind of unitary in terms of methodology, then of course, right, that there are different ways of generating knowledge that is of disciplinary or perhaps interdisciplinary, going back to the beginning, value, but that don't seek to impose a particular way kind of on of knowing on everybody and everything within the discipline. And I think that kind of recognition and that advancement in our understanding of causality has contributed to this.
When older scholars in the past, especially when they had sources like newspaper, maybe some books, it was always in a written form. Now we have the internet and everything is almost in real time. So when you publish an article in 2024, 25, it means that you research it in 23, maybe data might be from 22, so you already have like 2 years sort of like gap between what was when you were researching and what is now when the article is published or was published. So how do real-time data analytics disrupt the balance between that empirical depth and immediacy in political research?
One, I mean, to kind of that, this is something that is, again, not necessarily a new problem, right? Scholars, like people who are kind of are engaged in kind of academic writing and the peer review process for years, have talked about, acknowledged that usually kind of what's in print is something that you probably presented at a conference 3 years ago, maybe submitted to a journal 2 years ago, went through peer review kind of over a year ago, and then kind of typeset, and then was there the delay being longer in the past because often you didn't see your article until like it appeared kind of in print or kind of indexed in the actual journal issue that it was supposed to come out, which meant you had to wait. Whereas now there's like a lot of kind of access to preprints of accepted journal articles before they come out, which in one kind of reduces in some cases some of this time. But I think that's the real question that you're asking is a slightly different one, and that's the question of the data that's out there. And it used to be that when students would kind of study international relations, right, the kind of the real time data, like kind of what differentiated scholarship, right, was the ability to draw distance from kind of the newspaper and the op-ed and the kind of the other pieces of writing, and the ability to apply kind of methodological rigor to that. And today, right, it's not just kind of the real-time data posing a problem for researchers, but this is kind of a broader governance problem. That as you see from contemporary armed conflicts or dramatic political developments, whether they be kind of in Bangladesh and centering around protests, or they be kind of on the battlefield in places like Ukraine, right? You have instant access to information. That information is kind of uploaded. You have all of this, all these perspectives, right? And you have the kind of ability of researchers to kind of harness this and run data analytics on it in real time. And you have this kind of this fast-paced kind of change, right? That is running parallel to that. And I think that for kind of a lot of researchers, not necessarily within international relations, but if you're looking at those who are kind of writing and publishing in some of these fields that are adjacent, that you have more use of kind of online paper, kind of instant kind of archives, right? Where kind of preprints or pre-publications, pre-peer-reviewed publication can be kind of uploaded, and you get kind of this broader sense. Now, of course, you're lacking the peer review element of that, and you've got working papers and all sorts of other papers that are informing this, and other kinds of writing that IR scholars are publishing as well in real time that respond to this. But I would say this is in part more, there are more types of outputs that people, that younger scholars today are engaged with, right? That can range from kind of social media to kind of web-based research, kind of chronicles or diaries, almost like blogs and the such, to some of these other more traditional kind of working paper, kind of are in progress paper series, where you do have broader scope for engagement as well with research that is in progress. And this, in a way, right, makes the kind of it does raise questions about the where people turn to kind of learn about what is happening, right? Like it used to, like in not just current events, but you think about in terms of scholarship, like what are scholars working on? What are they writing? Is there's more access that goes beyond the traditional kind of journal article format that many of us grew up with as being kind of the only or the kind of the paramount format. And this coincides with a separate issue that's not necessarily one that's related to methods, but that's kind of think about academic publishing more broadly, kind of the move to open access, the cost of accessing a lot of these peer-reviewed journals being cost prohibitive for kind of people in many parts of the world. Like all that coming together is suggests that this kind of ability to communicate is producing a lot more avenues for kind of research. It's not just kind of the IR scholar writing an op-ed in the New York Times every once in a while, right? Or kind of publishing a journal article, but rather you have a lot of different platforms and interactions that have crystallized that make doing gaining access. We can talk about this a little bit as well, because this is not a kind of one-sided kind of positive development, but if you think about like gaining access to the field, for example, for researchers, that this kind of the access that is provided by platforms that you've mentioned means that you can do a lot of work virtually that used to require researchers to be kind of physically present. And then you have a lot of interactions that are virtual instead of kind of being interactions that would require you to be somewhere. But again, kind of saves a lot of time, right? Because you can have real-time analytics, but then there's also another side to that.
There is one question that I received from students when I taught in Scotland, and I must ask you because that's a great opportunity. We were going through many papers and we were comparing the sources that researchers used. And we discovered, or we came to conclusion, that many online sources, they just don't work anymore. So students, they went to a link, they click on the link, and it didn't work. And they asked the question, so how do we know if this research is legit? How do we know that this researcher used real sort of website link or data on that website if we can't access that link?
This is a good question, and it's good because it reminds me of like as undergraduates many years ago, or as students many years ago, right? You'd read something and then you could go back and you could go to the library, take the book that was
Yeah.
cited and go to the page, right? And it's like, okay, so this is what was argued in the kind of the original source that was cited. And this gets to one of the challenges of digital methods. Now, one kind of short response is that there are digital archives, right? Kind of like think about like Wayback Machine being one, right? Where you can like if you have the URL, you can kind of go back and find if it has been archived there, right? Some of the pages. But as you mentioned, that's not something that is useful or is helpful in every instance. And there are instances where things have completely vanished. There's also, if you might think about, for example, the ability of kind of social media platforms to also remove content, right? So a student might be doing research on something that has them looking at content that is being moderated by a social media platform. So if you think about kind of hate speech and such, or kind of other types of expression, right, which might be something that the student is researching, but then it vanishes, right? Right. And you don't have like when somebody clicks on those links to those posts, or it could be even like the user, the person who like posted them decided that they they didn't want them there anymore, so they deleted. And so like all of these particular posts don't exist anymore. And I think this points to a bigger question, right, that relates to digital methods more broadly, but knowledge in an era where a lot of research doesn't exist in kind of the traditional hard form and only exists on the web, which means that it's very transient, right, without any form of active archiving. And this points to a need, right, to better do this, right? And so if you think about like these sources that are used, often you have, this is why you have notations, right? So there are different perspectives on this, but like you can say like, okay, this is when it was accessed, right? And so you can go back and you can probably kind of trace, right, that there was something there when they did. But the question of like, how do you then trust? Digital research poses like a number of challenges overall. And one way to address the rapidly changing, right, the kind of the digital environment where URLs, links, social media posts, all these things are subject to disappear is to think back. An analogy would be, right, when you go into like a physical archive and you can't take the physical sources out, right, kind of taking pictures of some of these documents. Here you might think about like screenshots and saving them. For example, if you were doing research and you know, right, that there is a certain probability, right, that this data might not be there for very long, but it's kind of important, or you're kind of analyzing this, or you're looking at this for a particular reason, to kind of collect that archive on your own. But also it points to a bigger problem in relation to digital archives more broadly that relate to the need to preserve the written word or other forms of data on the internet that we find. And it's important, especially in the context where we're encountering a lot more challenges in discerning between what's real, what's human, and what's not on when it comes to digital sources and digital methods.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the shifts in research methods in international relations. And I have one question about the constructivist and postcolonial approaches and how they challenge the sort of empirical focus of traditional IR methodologies. So what's your view on that?
Well, I would suggest that if we think about empirical view, right, this gets back to the question of kind of positivism narrowly defined, that it's not necessarily a challenge, so to speak, right? Unless you're challenging kind of that methodological approach, right? This idea that there can only be one method, right? That if you think about, and so first of all, if we think about constructivism, it's important to remember that there are constructivisms, right? There's constructivism that just looks at kind of norms as another causal variable within the mix, right? And operates in a way that is intelligible to kind of most mainstream positivist research agendas. And then there's also constructivism thinking about kind of the kind of constitution kind of our social world, right? And these, as I say, and also if you think about kind of decolonial and postcolonial scholarship, there are pointing at two different things. So one is thinking about kind of constitutive questions in international relations, and kind of also maybe critical approaches focusing on the study of power. And the other is also kind of challenging this idea that there is kind of one particular hegemonic way of knowing, right, or of doing things, right? And so you see this in more kind of what we're more kind of pluriversal approaches to international relations, right? And so if we see these as different ways of approaching kind of the empirical, right, which is essentially kind of referring to kind of making sense of the kind of our textual or other kind of data sources within international relations, it's not necessarily kind of one that is one necessarily displaces entirely the other, but thinking about doing kind of answering different questions with different sets of tools.
Are there any methodological innovations that we can use to bridge the gap between something which is regional, like regional case studies, and something that we apply for global or international in terms or regarding generalization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say kind of getting back to the question that you just asked, right? This idea of um, how do we inform, or how does international relations enrich itself with um, a real diverse set of knowledge sources, right? And it's been kind of a discipline that's been largely dominated for many years with the preoccupations and kind of the methodological kind of understandings or worldviews of those states, which were in terms of both power, but in terms of scholarship, right, were kind of the ones who where kind of traditional IR scholarship was incubated within. But that being said, right, that understanding kind of and tackling kind of and addressing a lot of the challenges that we encounter today in international affairs requires a broader engagement and broader understanding of a whole lot of phenomena that goes beyond the simple kind of can we explain, right, type or narrow kind of variable based definitions. And bringing in a understanding and awareness of as you said, kind of we kind of think about kind of different or kind of like or kind of approaches and ways of understanding that challenge some of these presuppositions can tell us a lot about questions that international relations has been focused on from the very beginning, right? Like power and how power operates and power relations among states.
As our system or as international relations as a field is getting more fragmented, we know multipolarity, we have like different regimes and different countries. There is a sort of like popularity of multi-level network analysis. What's your view on that? And do you see any trends when we mention or when we speak about this particular method?
Right. So, and this is something that kind of draws from kind of earlier advancements in network analysis, right? And so when thinking about fragmentation and drawing relationships and making sense, it kind of gets back to this bigger question of we were talking earlier about all the information and data that's out there that's available to researchers, that if you have like 70 or 120,000 different kind of points of data that you're looking at, right? That some of these methods and these tools derived from network analysis can be powerful in pointing out relationships and connectivities in the context of what we would observe to be broad fragmentation. So I'd say like if that's kind of within that particular context, right, there is a utility to it. And it also gets to the question of kind of how do we study international relations in a world where international relations is happening on many different platforms, right? And you see this in terms of kind of digital diplomacy, right? But also a lot of other practices that are both engaging with and seeking to harness this, and also how a lot of these analytics then inform how practitioners of international relations understand the problems that they are facing and how they respond to those problems. So I think kind of having this engagement is one that's important. But again, kind of getting back earlier, it's not kind of the only way to make sense of international affairs in this period of time that we are living in.
How do you see and how do you understand when a researcher has a limited access or there is a confidentiality and he wants to use or she wants to use some research methods, but there is a challenge, which ones and why? So what would be your piece of advice for researchers? Because I quite regularly meet people who are asking me similar questions, and I'm also a little bit puzzled, like what to say. What would be the best approach? And sometimes you think you want to do the best because you don't want to make up anything. But on the other hand, you can't prove that this was that sort of data that you use.
This, I assume here, right, you're kind of implicitly referring to, if you think about like interview methods, for example, and you're thinking about access and you're talking to people who are involved in a policy process, and those people might be comfortable sharing information with you, kind of in background, or kind of don't necessarily want to be kind of attributed, right? Um, but at the same time, as a researcher, right, there is a need, right, a kind of obligation, right, to provide kind of transparency, so that when others kind of are reading our work, they can have a high degree of confidence that, okay, this is where this particular observation might come from, and this is what it means, and these are limitations, potential limitations of it. Now, access is important, right? In the sense that when you're kind of doing interview research, often the people you seek to talk to don't have a lot of time, right? And as a researcher, you are trusted, right? And so you have a relationship of trust that you maintain with those who are you are interviewing, because if you don't have that, then you don't have access. But at the same time, there are limits. And I would say here, right? I mean, just to be very clear about when you're talking to people, like there are very important things that individuals can share with you as a researcher on background that can point you in a particular direction, right? So you might not have thought about something else like, oh, but this is really important, that informs discussions. And so you can find other sources, right? Think about kind of triangulating that are pieces of evidence. And if you can't really find anything, then also you might think as well, like, okay, what does that, how then do you as a researcher evaluate what you were being told in that particular context? But I would say in terms of interviews, they are social interactions, right, between you, the interviewer, and it's more than just a kind of getting data from a data set, for example, right? There is kind of a element of understanding between kind of the person who's being interviewed and the researcher, as to the kind of research project, but also as to kind of the information that is being shared and why it's being shared. And I think that as a researcher, that this is something that you would inherently encounter in terms of your own work, especially when researching topics that are associated with politics and international relations, or processes associated, like you might be looking at kind of different countries' positions in the context of a multilateral negotiation or something like that. And certain things can be shared that would enrich your knowledge, but you cannot necessarily quote. Now, I would say that kind of in aggregate, this usually makes the quality of your work better, right? So people who know a lot about this process would read it and be like, okay, yeah, this person is clearly informed about these processes. But I would say if you're doing everything that you have promised to do through your kind of own ethics committees or institutional review processes, right, and there are varying degrees of anonymity, which you are able to offer interview respondents. And of course, kind of keeping in mind that some might want to be like totally off the record, that there are ways to integrate this into your own research that improves the quality of the research, even though you don't necessarily quote it in your research.
Okay, so when you were writing the second edition of the book, is there any method that you think that it required much more attention today than in the past regarding to explain how to use it or to explain what's the purpose of this method?
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, that kind of did touch on several chapters, but I would say where it was most visible is if you think about the impact of kind kind of large language models on research and kind of digital methods more broadly, which was kind of like cross-cutting in the past, right? It was kind of like it was kind of part of accessing kind of data, like sometimes kind of be housed within archival research, and you can say, oh, but they're digital archives and they're kind of physical archives. But when you think about digital archives, a lot of people and kind of a lot of the assumption is that, oh, what you're doing is you're taking what was once a physical archive, right? Something that existed, kind of like you might think about kind of in Slovakia, right? Kind of the physical archives that exist and digitizing them, right? So which means that that helps in terms of transparency, in terms of searchability, in terms of access to information. You have big projects also in the US, right? Like kind of like I think about the Wilson Center's Cold War archives, right, which are kind of taking kind of physical archives and digitizing them and making them kind of more broadly accessible. And there, that kind of like fits within kind of the paradigms and norms and methods of how we understand research. But what we talked about just moments ago, right, researchers looking at the kind of the not digitized archive, but the digital archive, meaning that you're looking at researching data or kind of using data that never really existed kind of in physical form itself, that raises a number of other questions in relation to one kind of how you go about doing that. Unfortunately, it's getting harder, right, for researchers to access information from social media companies about these, right? It used to be that was something that was easier to do, but a lot of these companies, they've tightened up, right, access to it, meaning that that you kind of can scrape kind of information and can scrape data, but it's more limited. But also this is shifting, right? And also the other thing that we didn't really have is kind of in the past, you might think of evaluating a digital source as kind of clicking on a newspaper, right? And you would have sources that were kind of fake, that were kind of part of broader either mis or disinformation efforts that were kind of pretending to be a media source, but after a few clicks, right, you could realize that this is not kind of a source necessarily that you would trust. Fast forwarding to 2025, when it's very easy to create a vast amount of kind of fake or altered or non-human digital content, whether these can be bots on social media, which means that, like, okay, so if you want to look at representations of a particular issue or narratives of surrounding a particular question on a social media platform, how do you disaggregate the kind of the non-human, right? All the bots, right, from your study, from the kind of what you're actually interested in, and that's kind of those who are, or you might turn around and study, right, the bots as well. And the other issue is, as I mentioned kind of at the outset, is the advent of can we cite, how do we reference, right, texts that are generated by large language models? And that's something that is new, right? From the first edition, which preceded the advent of these models.
Chris, there is artificial intelligence everywhere. And when you open YouTube or Facebook, right, or other social media, it's all about how AI can help your research to be the best in the world, and you don't need to do anything, and within 2 hours you have a literature review done and all those things. What is the impact of AI when you were writing the book? That's the first question. What sort of thoughts you had and you basically dealt with? And the second question, maybe your academic overview of AI and research methods from the point of view of being professor. What's your opinion, and how does AI influence research methods at the moment, and what do you think will happen in next years as we're getting into the stage that without AI we are unable to basically wake up in the morning because everything is AI at the moment. It's a big hype and it's all about AI.
Well, one thing is first, because you're alluding to kind of like this, like kind of, oh, kind of the researcher no longer has to do anything, right? I'd hope we'd all have, and this is for students as well, more curiosity about the subjects we are researching than that, right? That you really want to know, right? And that's different than having a large language model give you um, a token-based summary of what is ultimately a reflection of its own algorithmic design and the data that it's been trained on, right? And so there is a limitation here, and of course we know that the technology is getting better. The technology in each iteration is able to do kind of more better than in the past, but for research, right? And I think that for the types of research questions that we are interested in, um, the AI in itself will change certain things, but it'll change things the way like Excel, I think, changed statistics, right? Um, and that's also guided machine learning, right? But there are applications for it, and it'll change how we interface with or how we ask questions, right? How we get information. But nonetheless, the understandings of its limitations, I think, I guess, is what's new, right? Is that we need to understand, and there's something that we don't talk about enough, and that's this not we talk about like things like kind of algorithmic biases and training biases, but there's also an automation bias, right? Which is simply referring to our trust in what these technologies are telling us, right? This kind of this without really understanding kind of the thought process, right? The kind of that how this is being processed and then produced for us. And if we think about, get back to, for example, like international relations scholars have long been interested in concepts of studying power, right? That this potentially is a very powerful tool for shaping how we understand and practice international relations, right? And so knowing that, being able to kind of understand and interrogate and understand the limits of these outputs is something that drives a lot of curiosity and drives my own curiosity, right? In terms of understanding, I've recently kind of been interested in this in the context of transitional justice, right? So we think about AIR research more broadly, but you think about, well, how do these tools shape the work of future truth commissions or even criminal trial processes, where you have the ability to analyze, right, large amounts of data with relatively little kind of human input or oversight in that data processing process. And the question is that, well, if you're looking at a particular question or problem set where there's kind of a lot of data and it kind of overlaps well, then it can be very powerful. But given kind of the focus of what we are looking at and the challenges and problems that we are encountering in the context of our own research, these are not tools that are meant to provide those types of answers. So I think that in terms of research, while the kind of the platforms and tools available to us as researchers will change, the purpose of our research and our intellectual curiosity will continue to drive our research in this context, right? We're as researchers, we're not kind of marketers for a kind of company that's trying to kind of come up with a social media marketing campaign, which is going to which can rely a lot more, which probably does rely, of course, a lot more on these texts. But we are engaging in research and data analysis where we're trying to kind of arrive at a deeper understanding of these phenomena. And so I think within that particular context, if you see AI as a tool within that context, one of many tools, then that gives you a sense of, well, kind of the researcher, this is not something that, I mean, it could save time in the sense that kind of citation software saves right time in terms of a research paper, but at the same time, the our role as a researcher, right, and kind of our ability to kind of make knowledge claims and to evaluate these claims really requires us to be able to unpack the data upon which we are basing our observations.
Chris, the last question for today's interview. Which research method in international relations and politics needs more research to be better understood?
Oh, this is a good question. It's one that is challenging to answer in kind of just like saying this is the only one, right? That needs more research to be better understood. But I would say, kind of drawing on from our previous discussion, right, that I would say field work and its interface with digital methods, right, needs a lot of work. I think that there are a lot of assumptions about digital spaces that we have that collide with the ability of the state to govern digital spaces, right? So if you think about like early emancipatory research, like kind of on the internet, right, as this kind of freewheeling space that governments can't control or states can't control because there's just so much out there. Well, your last question about AI made it a lot easier for states to govern digital spaces, right? Because you don't need like an army of human beings in some Ministry of Interior somewhere going over web pages, right? But you can have powerful AI models that are kind of scraping, right? That are watching, that can identify and they can pull up for review particular terms or particular statements or kind of other types of content that a state is looking for, right? And so the ability of the state to monitor, right, and police the digital realm is something that's quite powerful. And if we're thinking about doing research, for example, here, this framework kind of, we're talking over Zoom. I mean, Zoom does tell us what kind of servers, right, that this is hitting and that they are using in for the purpose of this interview. But there might be some contexts where doing certain field work in digital spaces might introduce new elements of harm that we should be sensitive to for the researcher and for kind of research participants. And also the kind of ability, right, to kind of just interact with the field like it used to be. For example, you'd apply for a research grant and you'd be kind of doing field work somewhere and getting kind of a broader sense, kind of not just through kind of the interviews themselves, but kind of through the kind of the broader process of what you are researching. Whereas here, if you think about using kind of user-generated social media content or other types of content or other types of interactions, you are, one, not sure of many things, and kind of alluded to this earlier, but one is kind of whether or not these are kind of real people, right, that are generating these, but also the analysis that you derive from that is an analysis of digital content, right? And so this is the question of, so is this, right, if you were, is this really, is this a different type of field, right? Or is it kind of a field, I mean, it interacts, right? Because the digital kind of co-reproduces the world in which we live. It's like, it's hard to imagine, right, them as like totally disembodied. So kind of understanding this going forward, seeing how this affects research agendas, and is something that's going to be very important in the context of a world where there is a huge demand for being able to distinguish between kind of sources. As you mentioned, like your students are asking, like, okay, so how do I evaluate between this particular source and another source. This is a challenge, right, that we are encountering even more as you have the ability to, on scale, right, create huge amounts of sources that might be talking about something that never happened, right? So I would say that's one place to keep an eye out for, but it's kind of cross-cutting, right? Because if you think about field work, you think about focus groups, you think about interviews, and you think about other forms of research, this definitely impacts upon it. And even impacts upon, you might think about quantitative work relating to, you might think of multi-layer, multi-layered network analysis, for example, that we talked about earlier, is that just like, what are the data points that are being kind of scraped up and included, right? And are they like being counted as like kind of actual kind of people, right, who might have posted versus those who are not, right? And so I think we could probably kind of have an entire discussion kind of on this particular aspect, but kind of the short answer is, I would say, kind of looking at the kind of the interface between kind of field work and digital methods.
Definitely, research methods in IR and politics, it's one complex and complicated field. But I'm happy that we could record this episode, because I think it's always good to remind researchers and everyone about those research methods challenges. So research methods, that's always something that we should consider. And even if you are experienced senior researcher, it's always good to go through few books or few literature articles about the research methods, because there is always something new that we can implement in our research. Chris, many thanks for sharing your research outcomes, and I'm very thankful that we shared those insights with our viewers. So thank you for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you so much, Martin, for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.